is that we're like 3 weeks into this conversation, and only now are we at the point where we're like, okay, now we can begin.
Now what?
Yeah, now what? Now, how do you actually do this? And one of the feelings that's coming up for me in this part of the conversation is we did not design this to avoid starting, but now that we're at the point of starting, I can recognize how easy it is for me to want to avoid starting to be vulnerable. Right. So like it was necessary in this case for us to talk about like, defining what vulnerability is and then look at what gets in the way. And so instead of jumping right into being vulnerable week 1, it's not until the 3rd week that we're doing it.
It's clearing the path.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that makes a whole lot of sense. And yet, like the actual, like thinking back on times that I have practiced this, practiced being vulnerable and done the things that we've talked about so far, that first step is always the like,
oh yeah,
okay,
yeah. Like, someone just pushed me, please.
Yeah. Man, is it really easy to like buy for me? It's really easy to buy into all the reasons why I, in those moments, think maybe I shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
Not to go back to what gets in the way, but like just recognizing taking that first step, how to take that first step. I think part of it is like, okay, yes, these things seem very real. These reasons seem very real to the point of like, yeah, no, that's definitely going to happen. Like, it's definitely unsafe, even though I'm in a space where it's not. It definitely is whatever. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to say anything. I'm just, nope, not going to be vulnerable here. Going back to the knowing piece, like knowing myself well enough to know that that's my MO around this.
Thing. Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay, I'm doing the thing. Fine.
Even just naming it, was fear, uncertainty, comparison, like all the things, right? Naming what gets in the way, it has that kind of effect in my mind, kind of how we talked about shame last month. It's like when we name it and we put a spotlight on it and we talk about it and we call it what it is, then it really kind of loses some power and then creates space for us to step into a different way. I think the same thing with, when we talk about things that scare us or challenge us or some barriers or blockages and things like that, there's this teaching in New Thought, we don't want to name the thing because we're going to create more of the thing.
Yeah.
No, I don't think that's true. Actually, in these things, by naming the barrier, it actually reduces the power because then we can see it for what it is. That, oh, I feel this way when I'm being vulnerable. Oh, that's just fear, right? And we can even like say, fear, we know that you're very valuable in some aspects of our lives and maybe not here. So you can be here and that's okay, but I'm going to have you sit in the passenger seat right here and just be quiet. All right. Yeah. And we're going to navigate this. Then we can step into these really big things that really crack the door open, allowing, opening, knowing, like exploring those things about ourselves, being really curious. I think curiosity comes in with knowing, obviously. So I think it is. I mean, I think it was really important to create that space to kind of know what we're looking at, know what gets in the way, and like, oh, we know those things. All right, now let's do the thing, right?
Yeah. I love that idea of like there being power in being the one to name the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. And even if it is fear, even if the thing is fear, then it's like, oh, well, maybe fear is, well, I mean, we have a whole thing about fear. I have a whole thing about how we tend to talk about fear. And we're afraid of like mentioning fear, of bringing up, we're afraid that it's going to be fear or whatever. Right. But okay, so it is fear. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean you're like an awful person. It doesn't mean you're experiencing this thing that you shouldn't have or whatever, right? Like everybody has fear about something. Everybody has fear sometime. Fear, when we name it, if we're the one to name it, right? We're like, yes, I recognize that as fear. And maybe it's uncomfortable. Maybe there's discomfort involved. But being able to name it, then we get to look at it for like, why is it there? Like if we're afraid to even look at or name the thing, or if we're just trying to avoid it, we don't know why it's showing up. We don't know what's actually happening. Yep. And so we're just looking at symptoms. But if we can look at it like the cause, I was like, oh, there's fear in this sensation, or there's fear in this moment or whatever. It's like, oh, oh, there's fear because I care. This feels important.
Yeah.
Got it. Then you get to the knowing, right? If you know yourself well enough to be like, oh, yeah, I have fear right here. I'm afraid to say this thing. I'm afraid to be vulnerable in this moment because this feels really important. And if this isn't received in the way that I think I would like it to be, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I would do. I'm not sure how I would take it. I'm not sure. There's an uncertainty in that fear. Oh, fear. It's there because this feels important.
Yeah, and I think we talked about last week, fear as just a information gathering, right? And I think that's what
Yeah.
you're speaking to, information gathering. And so when we gather that information, then we can begin to um, kind of navigate this experience of allowing and letting go and letting things in, and an interesting component about allowing is when we don't allow some things in, when we have those blocks and barriers of allowing things in, that connection, then nothing can get out either. So nothing gets in or out. And so then our fullest expression of who we are is unable to be expressed in the world. And I mean, I talk about like this is easy. It's not easy, but it is an interesting
Just allow it.
thing.
It's fine.
And when we don't allow anything in, we also don't allow anything out. And so vulnerability is kind of the gateway for both of those. And I think there are lots of things that are vulnerable, trying new things, doing new things, changing our mind about something, right? That's vulnerable. Meeting new people, expressing ourselves in ways that we haven't expressed ourselves before. All those things are vulnerability. And without, our willingness to show up, and like I said, sometimes it's willing to be willing, for me at least, then we can't really activate and explore that in our lives,
Yeah. Well, I think that's why vulnerability is so crucial to connection and building to even being in a relationship.
I mean, it's imperative.
Yeah, right. Like,
right.
I think it's, I don't know, my history with vulnerability before I really started knowing what it actually is or what it actually feels like. My history says it's a one-way thing, and you should be vulnerable. I'm not going to be, and this is going to be a great relationship.
I'm going to wait and see. You be vulnerable. I'll wait and see.
But it doesn't really work that way, right? Like,
no,
we can't have a one-way. It's like a one-way relationship, right? You can't not have vulnerability reciprocated,
which is not a relationship, right?
Right. Yeah, that's I mean, I think I mentioned a lot, but that the codependency, I'm going to call it an issue that we have in our history, at least here in the United States. That's exactly what it is. It's like pretending to have full relationships.
Yeah.
We have, I think, a deep history of one-sided, one-directional, or no-sided and no-directional relationship.
Right.
Yeah. How do you have any sort of connection without vulnerability of both people?
Right.
Or of all people, whatever kind of relationship it is, right?
Because vulnerability is seen and being seen. So it takes both directions with that.
And so if I'm not going to share, if nothing of me gets out, I can't actually share. I'm the only one then who knows who I am.
Yeah.
If I'm not going to. Now, again, it is a practice, and we do need to be gentle, and we do need to build the spaces and the skills and kind of cultivate the people that it's
layered. It's a layered process.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is not a really common thing yet out in the world. I think there's still a lot of traditional framework and structure and things going on that are influencing people to be in that very like rugged and cut off kind of way of being, or at least think they should be, whether they want to be in that structure or not. It's this belief that we should be, right? Yeah. And I think that goes back to the willingness piece too, right? So like, I can have all the willingness in the world here, like talking about, like, I know I'm going to be vulnerable, and it's gotten easier, and yet it's like, just because I can be vulnerable here about this thing doesn't mean it's any easier at all to be vulnerable here about this thing. Yeah. I've found I can have all the willingness in the world, but when there are certain things come up, man, it's like, is it really easy to believe in the that story is true. Like my whole life's been based around this thing. I can't, no way. I'm not just gonna.
Well, and that just supports this idea that, you know, those things, those beliefs, those frameworks, those default ways of whatever have been built over time, over this process, over this layered and reinforcement,
In that
reinforcement,
structure,
layered
yeah,
reinforcement.
yeah,
And so this idea of vulnerability and showing up different is just kind of that like uncovering, okay, uncovering,
take a
oh,
breath.
maybe recovering. Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah,
So it's like almost like kind of if it doesn't like dispel the layers all in one swoop, it kind of loosens them a little bit,
yeah,
you know? And so I think that that's what we have to do. And that comes with the gentleness, that comes with the exploration that you talked about like knowing ourselves, right? I mean, I think that's the first thing, you know, to show up vulnerably, I have to like know on some level today, right? You know, who I am, you know, the core values, those things that are important to me, those things that are important for me to express and to make known into the world, you know. And I think that that is the first key. Otherwise, when we begin just to operate from other people's expectations of who they think we should be,
yeah.
right? And so then we're like bypassing that whole exploration, self discovery, looking at all the stuff sort of thing. And we just want to jump into like the other stuff, but we can't do that because then we can never come from a space of authenticity. And I think that's why vulnerability and authenticity are kind of like married together, right?
Yeah.
You can't have one without the other. And so I think that that knowing piece is so key.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the hardest piece because we've been inundated with other people's knowing of us.
Yeah.
And then we just kind of play along. Oh, okay, yeah, that sounds good. Let's just go with that. And that's what
Right.
I'm expected to show up this way. That can be like rattling to your core, right?
Yeah.
You begin to
Yeah.
explore, oh, wait, I've lived this period of time doing this, but that's really not who I am, but it's who I thought that I should be, right? And so,
Or who you needed to be.
right. So, I mean, this is like dismantling all sorts of
Yeah.
things. And it can, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it can be really disconcerting and confusing and whatever, like a whirlwind, dizzy sort of
Yeah.
feeling when we begin to do that. But then we get to begin to create from that really firm foundation of who we are.
Well, and isn't that the importance of having some sort of community, whether it's
Yeah.
like a formal like spiritual community, or it's like you have a group of people who are kind of on this journey together, or even
Social community
therapy,
and
or I mean whatever.
stabilizing factor, yeah.
Yeah, something that's like you're like don't. This is not a thing we go through on our own, which may be why this hasn't really been a widespread or even maybe agreed upon idea, because we're coming from this like very self-reliant framework structure history that says, yeah, you shouldn't be reliant on anyone else for anything. And what we're doing here is like you kind of almost have to be, in a way. Like I can be vulnerable with myself, and that certainly is like a necessary step and process and journey.
Right.
And the whole idea of self-expression, the whole idea of life itself is to express itself for life to know itself, which means there has to be people receiving that experience. We don't live, exist, or create in a vacuum. So there has to be this interaction. And so for me to share myself with anyone or anything, there has to be somebody there. And so we're not doing this alone. Like you probably can't do it alone. It's kind of like we like peak at first. We're like, is it maybe, I don't know, and we kind of like test the waters. And it brought to mind when you got your dog.
Ah, yes.
Right. So this dog came from probably a very abusive scenario, was probably caged in a cage that was too small. I mean, like not good.
All the bad things. Yes.
All the bad. Yeah. And so I think the first time I saw your dog was like a week or two after they came to you, and wow, like, I mean, super skittish, like appeared to be afraid of basically everything, like wouldn't go outside to, like, I remember you telling me stories of literally having to like pick the dog up, carry them outside for them, to do their dog
In the
show.
trail of cheese.
Yeah, right. Yes, and then that got that
Yeah.
then turned into baiting them with a trail of cheese. I mean, but it was this whole process of like relearning,
Mm-hmm.
rewiring, re-experiencing. If life always said this,
Yeah.
well, that's what I'm going to expect to happen. And so it was this like slow peeking out of a new experience. And like, is it safe here? Is it,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it is, kind of learning like it is safe here. Like, okay, you're safe, and then I don't know if it was a couple months later, whenever it was, I was there and saw the dog again. And it was like, clearly the two of you had a relationship where like he felt safe enough with you, but then like we showed up and it was like, not so sure about this.
Look what the cat drug in.
Yeah, right. But then like a year later, it's a whole other story.
He's a wild man now.
Yeah. I mean, it's still got a little skittishness, which like, okay, some of that's just personality, but
Yeah.
wow, what a world of a difference. And I think that it's kind of the same for us. Like, we're going to always expect to see life show up the way it's always shown up.
Mm-hmm.
And so why would it be any different this time? And if this uncomfortable, dangerous, unsafe, negative experience has always happened, why would I expect anything else to happen here? If no one in my life has been vulnerable before, or at least if that's what the story says, if the story says it's not safe because no one else has ever been vulnerable, don't share this part of you because it's never been received well. Why would we expect it to be different this time? And yet I do think there's like this evolution of human awareness that is like we're in the middle of, that is now like, no.
Yeah, not so much, right?
It should be different this time. It's going to be different. Maybe this, be cautious, be slow, take baby steps, but yeah, it can be different. It can be different. And there are other people who are wanting the same thing, and that's different and also uncomfortable at times.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's like also, that's not to say that once we become vulnerable and kind of really comfortable more and more about doing this, that we're not going to have fear creep up or comparison creep up or all the things that get in the way creep up. Because I think some of these are experiences, especially like in our formative years. I mean, they're with us. We're not going to get rid of those experiences.
Right. Yeah. They don't go away. Yeah.
Right. And
we don't like weed them out and they're gone. Right. Yeah.
Right. And so we just now have a different relationship with these experiences, right? They're still there. And sometimes we may be back there really quick, but because we have a different relationship with them through our practice of vulnerability and authenticity, we can say, oh, wait, we went down a wrong path there for just a second. Let's come back to the truth. Right. And so it's that the goal is not to get rid of those things that show up in our brains, or even those default things that come, because they have been so ingrained in us. It's not to get rid of them per se, but it's to foresee them for what they are and shift our experience around them. And I think that also happens with this, this self-discovery, this awareness, this allowing, this experience, because then we begin to open our experience for other things than that, right?
Yep.
And allow life to show up in other ways than what we've been accustomed to. This is the experience of being human. This is the experience of wholeness. But it's just to change our relationship to them, our perspective to them, and then begin to step out in ways that are in alignment with who we are and that really speak to our full self-expression.
And then I think these 3 steps we've been talking about today, knowing yourself, being willing, and then being willing to open up,
right?
It almost starts this like cycle of like, okay, you start, all right, I'm gonna, to know myself well enough to feel brave enough to be vulnerable, to take the first step in being vulnerable. Right? So now I'm willing. Okay, now I'm going to open up this tiny crack with this safe person, right? And then that brings us back around to knowing again.
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh,
it's like a cycle. It's like,
what does that look? All right, now that
I
can know that part about me differently than before. That's never happened before. This is new. Okay, let me go back to knowing. All right, am I willing to be vulnerable about this part of me? And then we open up a little bit for, it's like
an expanding process, right?
Yeah.
But it's like this kind of 3-step.
Yeah.
And I think once we begin to do that and build a lot of confidence around that, then we can begin to, this is talking about, this week we're talking about kind of on the individual level, but I think that the more that we get better at doing an individual level, then we can become this kind of, which will be next week, is this kind of collective level. And so then we can begin to create those safe spaces, those frameworks, those systems that support this sort of process, the freedom of this sort of process for everyone. Because, like we have said many weeks now, this is not the experience of everyone, because a lot of people in our world aren't able to show up in these ways out of their own personal safety, because we have systems and frameworks that are actively working against them.
Yeah.
So next week we're going to be talking about, like, how can we use this individual experience and now blueprint it on this collective experience, and then like the shift that happens when we could have that collective vulnerable sort of experience and begin to create those spaces.
So this week I'm gonna take those 3 steps with me and think about that. The what do I know about myself? Where am I willing to engage in that part of myself with somebody else, and then actually do it? Like actually like creak open a little bit.
Keep your little head out. Whoop, there we are.
And it's interesting. It does. I think this is probably universal. It does feel like that. It does feel like just peeking open, no matter how many times you've been vulnerable about anything. Like it's always, it does seem to have that very beginning feeling every time, doesn't it?
The struggle is real, right? It really is. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us for this episode of Truth Be Told, where we've been exploring this on the individual level, stepping into vulnerability by knowing, by allowing, and being open to the wholeness and the fullness of life, and how when we do that, we can begin to show up in ways that are in alignment with who we are and bring our whole selves to life. So if you'd like to explore this topic a little bit further, please join us for our Thursday night gathering at 7 p.m. Eastern. We get together and we talk about the topic of the week, which is vulnerability, letting in and letting go, and then just begin to share our own experiences on a more individual level and begin to learn from the experiences of others. It's always an amazing time. We have so many great events that are coming up. There's so many other videos and information and events and everything coming up. You can learn more about that at soulevolutioncollaborative.org. If we do not see you at any of these events, hopefully we'll see you back here next week for another episode of Truth Be Told.